Thank you all, and good morning. It's actually sunshine outside. Well, don't let me start talking about that because it could change in a heartbeat. So, good morning to the task force members. Good morning to all of you from the public who are supporters and of this effort now and going forward. I'm sure you're all aware this is our 6th meeting. We have one more to go, at least in this phase of our work in the process. Before we finalize our plan and our recommendations, we've got just another meeting of education, and I think you'll find today's agenda and our experts to be very informative and very helpful at this stage of our journey. I hope you've seen by now that we changed the date of our final meeting from June 4th to June 25th. We flex in the process to do what is necessary to make sure we have a quality product, and so this date change is a big part of that. It will give us more time to finalize recommendations, make sure we've summarized all of our learnings, and also to make sure we have time to process those recommendations with you before we come back to the next meeting. We also understand that there will be some who will not be at the next meeting because we've changed the dates, and we will make sure we identify a process and approach for including not just your input, but your agreement to the final set of recommendations, so have no concerns about that. As we begin our day today, let me thank our friends from Barrack Recreation Center for allowing us to be here this morning. I had not been here before, and so I think this was a great idea for us to get into our neighborhoods and into our communities where we know we will do work so that we all can, at least for this moment, touch and feel and on an ongoing basis be more engaged. This location is in one of the neighborhoods that is already starting to work to address infant mortality, so it helps to remind all of us of the importance of place-based approach to work. We know that our success will be in large part dependent upon our partners, and this includes partners in the neighborhoods, residents, and organizations at the neighborhood level. Over the last 5 months, and I know it's hard to say, it's been 5 months already, but we've learned quite a bit. We've seen evidence of best practices related to preconception health, unplanned and teen pregnancies, prenatal and perinatal care. And what we will do today is spend time on sort of the next phase of our educational journey, and that is how communities, cities, and neighborhoods and other locations have pulled together the pieces to move their infant mortality numbers down, and down in astonishing levels. Today, our experts will share and tell us how other communities have used common dashboards to drive shared strategies. We'll hear directly from experts who've been in the trenches in Baltimore and in northern Manhattan, and to understand how they prioritized activities and resources to deliver on the results that make them what we aspire to be like and to do today. Lastly, we'll bring you back to some of our own neighborhoods, and I'm very much looking forward to this aspect. We have the Current Institute with us. They'll discuss assets and opportunities in specific neighborhoods, so we will have a heat map and overlaying all of the issues, social and clinically related, on that heat map. So, take notes, be sure to ask questions. This is a very packed agenda, so we will move swiftly, but there will be a point in it where we will say, if you need to take a break, but don't all of you take a break at the same time. You can work out some type of system so that we have enough here participating, but we also want you to be comfortable. And before we dig into all of that, we want to ask the task force, we want to hear what you've learned across the community in your efforts to engage when we've had the one-on-one meetings, so we'll have a little bit of that dialogue. But you'll also hear today from Sandy Harbreck, CEO Paul Worth Associates, and Marie Keister from Murphy Epson. They have been at the helm of convening and facilitating the conversations in the neighborhoods. And what they will do is debrief us on what they're hearing. Mike and President Ginther and I got sort of a highlight of that, and it's very interesting information, but I think his information will be very helpful as well. So what we hear today will be important not just to inform our recommendations, but it's also a critical first step in our efforts to engage and partner with key stakeholders, both at the community and the neighborhood level. Before we hear from Sandy and Marie, Council President Ginther, would you like to offer any comments?
Thank you, Donna, and I am very excited about today's agenda. I got a little bit of a sneak peek. I talked with a few of you earlier with Donna last night and Dr. Gabby and Dr. James to hear from some of the speakers that we're going to be hearing from today, and the information is powerful and inspiring, and so I'm looking forward to the conversation and engagement today. We'll now, I think, be able to see how other communities have put together different pieces and parts to move the needle in their hometowns, and in ways in which they organized but also held themselves accountable and kept stakeholders engaged over the long haul. The voices of neighborhood and community leaders are going to be so important in this work, and so it's good to hear an update from Sandy, and that's where we'll turn next to get an update from Sandy and Marie on all of the community and neighborhood stakeholder engagement that's been taking place. Some of you have been part of those meetings. I know I've been to well over a dozen at this point, talking with groups as small as 5 or 6 or groups of 100 to raise awareness, but also Marie has done a masterful job facilitating and gathering input and harvesting information directly from stakeholders and neighborhood leaders to inform our plan moving forward. So can't think of a better way to start off our agenda today. I'll turn things over to Sandy and Marie to update us on what we're hearing.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. We have had such an interesting experience going out into the community and listening to what our fellow citizens have to share with us. I have to begin by saying that the Council President Ginther and our co-chairs have been most forceful in saying that we really need to make sure that our community understands what we're about, and to make sure that not only do they understand what we're about, but also that we're listening and understanding what's going on in the community. And I don't know about you, but when I started working on this project, I was just amazed myself at our situation here in Central Ohio as to infant mortality. And when I talked to friends and colleagues, everyone said I had no idea. So a big part of our effort here is to make sure we begin the process of letting our community know what's really at stake and what some of the numbers are, and also what some of the issues are, as well as the work of the task force. So we have a few, let me just advance this here. We have a few goals today in our time together. We want to talk about what our goal was with community engagement. We want to talk about some of the initiatives we've taken on. We're going to share with you our methodology and some key findings. We have a brief video showing you some of the excerpts of the conversations we've been having out in the communities. We are presenting to you today 4 major themes. There are lots of conversations that took place, but as we stepped back and looked at what we heard, we realized that really there are, to our ear anyway, there are 4 themes that we think are important for us all to hear about today, and then some final conclusions and time for a couple of questions. Our goal here in community engagement is to begin a dialogue, a conversation, to hear what people in our community see as the obstacles and the opportunities, also to understand what's working and what's not working for people. We have taken what I would say is a comprehensive or holistic approach to our efforts so that we're also communicating information. We use traditional media, social media. We have a very robust website. We have some speaking engagements that many of you have helped us establish, and then the targeted stakeholder workshops, which is the part of the presentation that we'll spend the most time on this morning. But I did want to give you just a little bit of a rundown on some of the results that we have had to date. We've had about 40 different stories that have appeared in the Columbus media since the task force began. And these have been about all sorts of different aspects of infant mortality, including the work of the task force, but some of the causes and impacts. We also, this week, have Mario Drummonds, who's going to be speaking with Misty Crane of the Dispatch and Mandy Trimble of WOSU this afternoon. So we try to get our speakers out into the media. First Lady Karen Kasich, who I saw just walk in, will interview with focus on Central Ohio. We have we're working with Good Day Columbus on a story on the ABCs of sleep, safe sleep, and we're working with Ann Fisher's show on a Wellness Wednesday report. The social media has been amazing. We have, our Facebook page has more than 200 likes, the Twitter page has about 100 followers, and more than 2,000 subscribers to the e-blast that many of you receive before meetings and for updates. We have about 10,000 page views on our website, gcinfantmortality.org, and the average visitor spends time viewing about 3.5 pages. So we know they're engaged, they're looking, they're really spending some time on our website. So far, we've had 16 speaking engagements that we facilitated. We have 12 more to go, including an upcoming presentation to the Columbus Metropolitan Club on June 11th. So look for that. We've exceeded our goal by 20. In terms of our speaking engagements into the community, and again, that's in large part due to the efforts of all of you here today. We have reached out through those speaking engagements to more than 400 people in our community, from minority health groups to business leaders to neighborhood community commissions, healthcare organizations, a wide diversity of audiences there. Maria is going to talk with us now about the actual workshops that are being done in the community. These are more intensive activities or conversations, and we'll let her share those with you next.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you to all of you who have come and participated in the workshops, and also those of you in the room who have helped us organize and make sure that we had people attend. We really, really appreciated that. We have had more than 200 individuals participate, and it's really been a privilege to hear what people have to say to us. And we've ranged from people who are in the trenches providing service and helping our moms and babies be healthy, to those who were very new to the topic, or maybe were a participant in the topic and didn't even realize it. We had one woman come to our educator group and said, "Hey, I really don't know why I'm here. I deal with teens before they get pregnant, and I'm not sure why I can contribute." Well, she ended up being a just wealth of information, and thank you, Dr. Good, for helping us coordinate the teacher and physical education workshop. So we've ranged from educators, we went to the south side, we've talked to neighborhood leaders, we went to the pastors in our community, multicultural leaders, a wide range, and then just last week we had a workshop with teen, expectant, and new moms, which was really inspiring, and you'll hear a little bit more about that. So we wanted to know what's already happening that's successful, what do you think could be improved, what are the barriers, what can we do to break those down? And if you could improve one thing, or if you had a specific idea, or if you wanted to leave the task force with one image, what would that be? And with those 4 basic questions, we got a wealth of information. As Sandy mentioned, it really boiled down into 4 themes. Certainly, we all know as professionals that we need to continue improving the health care and services to our moms and our babies. But where we went off in a different direction from talking to this wealth of community members and citizens was that we need much greater collaboration and coordination between agencies, and we think that's really a symptom of a larger issue. We need to address the issues that go beyond health and health care and health services as we typically think of them. And that's when we start to get into neighborhoods and place-based strategies. We need to build and foster trust and meaningful community engagement. We heard the word trust quite a bit. So with that, I'm going to show you in their own words some of the stakeholders and what they had to say.
I lost two kids, one miscarriage, and then I'm pregnant now. So she makes sure that they check me every week. It's a regular prenatal care. It's a full visit every week. Sometimes it can go on for hours, but she calls me every week personally, and she'll tell me like, well, you can just chill this week. You don't, just lay down this week, or don't do a lot this week. A lot of doctors' offices will, they'll see you once a month. So someone that has been through what I've been through needs to be seen a lot more.
Horrible conditions, from the infestations of mice, rats, bugs, cockroaches. And the problem is that landlords aren't being held accountable. And the other problem is furniture. People are sleeping on floors with just a sheet, or there are no couches, so everyone's on the floor all the time. And for babies, it's cold, it's drafty, you have bugs crawling all over you, people are getting bitten by mice and rats, and these are all that's just unacceptable if you're trying to improve the health of moms and babies.
I think that starting earlier, talking about self-esteem and building character and goals, having goals. How do you see yourself? Where do you see yourself when you're grown? What kind of life would you like to have? And then as educators in the community, take the steps necessary to show them what does it look like to get there.
A mom that is addicted is pregnant, and she's doing her best to stay off the drugs that she's addicted to. They don't get that warm and fuzzy feeling when they walk into the office. It's, so when was the last time you smoked? Or when was the last time you shot up? Are you clean? It's not, how's the baby doing? Have you had something to eat today? That's the thing that everybody that's pregnant should feel.
With the people that we're trying to reach and the people who are trying to reach them, is that we need to stay connected, because it's very easy to throw out ideas and say this sounds good or that sounds good, but when you really begin to impact is when you have a personal connection with the issue and the people affected by it. And that's exactly what you'll have when you see the mothers and you see the children and you see the effect that it has, and you think about things like, hey, it would be nice to have a nurse go to this person's house, but maybe they're ashamed of where they live. There has to be another way. There has to be another way, and I may not be able to provide it, but maybe this person can provide it. And I know that this person says that, we don't have to come to your house, but we can come to someplace close to your house, a central area where we can give you the same services.
We can't always expect the moms to come to us as social service agencies. So Moms to Be is embedded in the communities. We're in places where moms can walk to us to get healthy food, to get education, and to get social support.
I would encourage the task force to take a look at the issue of intervention, particularly in communities of color and populations at risk, at a much earlier stage than what we're seeing right now in terms of intervention.
Okay, so you can't fix in 9 months what has taken a lifetime to develop. So when a woman walks in, you're dealing with her whole, for a prenatal care appointment or so forth, you're dealing with her whole health history, her whole lifestyle. And so the areas of concern that we heard from these groups ranged from no health education policy for middle schools. This was one that kind of surprised us when we were with the teachers and the guidance counselors and the Health instructors, they said there's pretty good policy at the state level for elementary school that they teach to. There's pretty good policy at the high school, but we're missing the middle schools. You saw a middle school teacher up there, as a matter of fact, principal, who was sharing that we're missing a huge opportunity that by the time teenagers get to high school, it's almost too late to help them understand how to be healthy and how to take care of themselves. So that was a big area of concern. Lack of access to family planning resources. Nurses in the schools said, you know, my hands are tied. There's only so much I can do to help these kids. I can help them after they get pregnant, but I sure can't do much to help them prevent getting pregnant. We heard the chronic physical and mental health issues, the substance abuse. And when those are issues that a mom is dealing with, taking care of a prenatal visit is the last thing on their mind. Maybe they're having domestic abuse issues. And again, getting to the hospital to make sure that they're getting those healthy care checkups, which we know make a difference, is really low on their priority list. Difficulty accessing programs. Some prefer to go directly to a hospital to get care, even if there's neighborhood-based services. Others really thought that the Wellness on Wheels program, for example, that goes into the community, was very vital. Lack of family support. We heard some wonderful voices talk about how a community doesn't necessarily embrace a teenager or a young woman when she gets pregnant. Instead, the woman feels judged, and a family may not know how to help the young woman and their family take care of a new pregnancy. So what were their ideas to deal with that? Well, the middle school education programs. This is where a policy may need to be considered at the state level. What can we do to include sexual health, self-esteem, healthy relationships, mental health, and nutrition at the middle school age? Focus on decreasing obesity, diabetes, and smoking. Provide easier access to family planning resources. When we talk to people about healthy pregnancies, these are the things that emerged. Again, that improved access. A lot of people have difficulty just getting transportation. We had a pastor tell us that he had a young person get pregnant in his congregation, and he referred her to a social service agency for assistance. And he first calls the telephone line just to see how his congregant would be treated. His wait time was so long that he gave up. And he thought, if I'm not going to wait long enough, how am I going to get this young person to do the same? Improve baby care education, such as breastfeeding and safe sleep. We found a lot of discrepancies and conflicting information out there, a lot of confusion. People are overwhelmed. On the healthy babies theme, within that improving health of women and children, we heard providing new mothers and their families with a comprehensive book of information or some sort of tool, because today they get flooded with pamphlets here and pamphlets there, and sometimes they work together, but a lot of times they don't. The women really said, we're overwhelmed and we're confused. And this was not just the low-income mom that was talking. We had a lot of moms actually come up to me privately afterwards and say, you know, when I was in the hospital having my baby, they looked at me and they thought, I must be pretty well educated and I can pay my bills, so I didn't need that extra help. But trust me, I was clueless with having a baby, and I would have appreciated that extra help as well. We also heard a lot about collaboration and coordination, and the phrase that has really stuck with us, and we use this a lot now when we recap what we heard from these stakeholder groups, we are program rich and system poor. There are some people in here who were in the frontline provider workshop. Home health care providers, nurses, people who go into the homes and really experience what's happening. And I went around the room and I asked them all to say what program they were in. There must have been 25 to 30 people in the room. And just a wealth of programs. So afterwards I said, how many of you in here learned today of a program that you didn't know about? They all raised their hands. How many of you in here today are very excited about what you heard, and you want to, after we're done here, you want to go talk to the other people who are working on those programs? They all raised their hands. I came away from that thinking, it's not that we're not doing the right things here. It's not that we don't know how to address this issue, but we're not talking. And we think that's a symptom of a larger lack of a system-wide approach to addressing this. So we heard lack of coordination. We heard providers at the first workshop we went to. We heard people who are tackling this issue, and they said, we talk, but our senior leadership does not talk. Or we compete. We are doing grant requests because that's how we survive, but it means hospital against hospital is pitted against each other. Some people said, we have a great program, but we lost our grant, so it went away. So that lack of sustainable funding. And then, of course, awareness continues to take place. People don't know what each other's doing. So some of their specific ideas: create a centralized tracking system that tracks programs and outcomes, create a centralized referral system, link funding to successful programs, move away from those competitive-based grant funding systems, and then a navigator system. And Michelle, I warned you, I was going to single you out, but the Community Shelter Board has a new navigator system. And the whole idea behind that is that, as we heard in our workshops, young women or older women having babies are overwhelmed. There are a ton of resources out there, but how do you access it? I know I get overwhelmed if I have to deal with more than one insurance company and this and that, let alone if I were trying to access social services. And so women really asked, and providers asked, if we could hold their hands through that process so that one woman doesn't have to look at a list of 20 providers and figure out what's the one that I need. An expert would help them. And this is something that Community Shelter Board is doing in their area that we think is an interesting model. And then women are so stressed out with their day-to-day living situation. As I mentioned earlier, taking care of baby is secondary. Taking care of their health is secondary. Getting to the doctor, it's low on their priority list. We heard this a lot from the pastors. We heard this from the neighborhood leaders. There's poverty and employment. There's lack of education. Transportation, that came back over and over again. Neighborhood safety, if there's a lot of crime going on. Affordable housing came up repeatedly, and housing conditions. And as Dr. Mashika Roberts said in the video, when you have a high infant mortality rate, it's a symptom of something that's ill in your community, and I'm paraphrasing, and that's what we really found talking to all these people. And so some of the proposed solutions were improving transportation options. Okay, this is where you have to take your healthcare hat off, and you think about what's making us fat? Why are we obese? Why do we have such a high rate of diabetes? Well, we're forcing people to get in their cars and go places. And so people talked about, boy, I wish services were at a place where I could walk to. Boy, I wish CODA could provide more transit. CODA was in the room, by the way, in one of our workshops. But it's not a matter of the transit service just always chasing where you go locate your service. Can you provide your service closer to a local transit stop? Are we designing our communities to be walkable? Can we create one-stop shop locations for women to receive comprehensive services? Develop those more affordable housing and safer choices there? What kind of incentives are we providing for landlords to make sure that our housing is safe? Provide more opportunity for fresh food. From Trent Smith from Franklinton Area Trade Commission talked about a program they have in Franklinton to provide fresh food in the convenience stores. It's not as easy as you think, because they make more money from the cigarettes and the junk food that's sitting there. People are more likely to buy that. So for them to move shelf space and put fresh food there and vegetables costs them money, and then it doesn't sell as well. So you can imagine that's hard for them to make that successful, but they're working on it. And then finally, trust and engagement. We heard this particularly from our African American faith leaders, how they talked about, we've been in the communities, we have worked so hard for years to build trust with the people who come to our churches, and let us help you, because we have that relationship with our congregants, and we want to help you get the word out. They were as shocked as all of us about the terrible infant mortality rates we have here. They want to be part of the solution, and they reiterated that. Moms-to-be talked about how it was important in their case that they really look like the people that they're serving. They go into the community, they really build those relationships, and that's what makes them so successful. Lily Kavanaugh, when we went and we talked with the multicultural group and the Latino community, They talked about you already have a wonderful network of relationships. You get information from each other, from people you know and trust. Those are the vehicles we need to use to be sharing information and making sure people get the information they need. We found a lot of conflicting information. Grandparents who have been with, who are tutoring and mentoring their daughters to raise children, but they have old cultural norms that we have found through years are not as safe as they could be when you're dealing with baby. But that's decades and generations of knowledge that in some cases we're going to have to start from there, but overcome that because some of the messages they're giving their daughters is now wrong. It's not safe. So we have to work within those confines. And so their specific ideas were having more peer-to-peer relationships, working with those grandmothers and grandfathers so that they're getting the right information to their daughters on how to be safe with their children. Developing materials and messages that are more meaningful. When we talk presumed eligibility, you can imagine everybody's eyes roll and they go to sleep. Do you think a new mom really knows what that's about? We have to find language that's very simple and accessible. Leveraging the faith communities, leveraging our neighborhood leadership. Westside Hilltop Area Commission said, wow, we didn't know this was a problem. As soon as you figure out what to do, let us know. Let us be your troops. Let us help you. We received a lot of that feedback. Develop a sustained education campaign. Everybody knows the pink ribbon means that we need to fight breast cancer. So there was a great suggestion that we develop something similar for our audience here. And then again, providing accurate, consistent information to our caregivers. We found some inconsistent messages even coming out of the hospitals from kangaroo care, meaning make sure you hug your baby and keep your baby close to your skin. Well, suddenly that's in conflict perhaps with, but don't ever sleep with your baby. And so women get a little confused by that. So just some of those nuances that we need to address. So in conclusion, I just want to say we were inspired, we were moved. The people shared in their own words how this is a problem that they were surprised about, but they had a lot of great ideas on how we can help address it. So we'd leave it open to any questions if you have them.
We also want to remind you that the next workshop will be our female faith leaders on Saturday, June 7th from noon to 2 o'clock at Tridestone Baptist Church. So we invite any of you to join us for that. There also are detailed meeting summaries and video statements from the workshop participants on our website. So we encourage you to learn more and dive into this subject as much as you'd like to. Thank you. Any questions before we turn it over?
How about any? I know a number of the task force members have attended these various community sessions. Any other thoughts or feedback that we haven't covered you'd like for us to touch on before we move on? Come on, I know we're awake. Jason?
So the one thing that struck me, and I feel a little unprepared to really understand it, is we are program rich and system poor. Okay, so that seems easy to fix. But it also seems like a naive statement to think that it's easy to fix. So for the group, I'm wondering, is there a place to start? Is there an obvious place to start with that statement? Does anyone question whether it's true or not?
Janet Jackson.
Excuse me. I would just share the perspective that I would believe that it is true. So I don't really know this system, but the system that United Way is in, the funding of our programs, I'm always amazed how agencies that do very similar work don't talk to each other, don't know what's going on. So I'm not surprised at all.
And from the perspective of the Asian Pacific Islander, Latino, and African immigrant communities, that is a fact that we deal with every day. These people, as you were talking before about trust and how critical faith leaders are within the African American community. Well, these organizations represent that trust to these folks. And each one of these organizations is constantly fighting and struggling to connect with mainstream services and trying to let them understand that I or them are the tool that is necessary in order to build that bridge. And I think through the conversations that we held, that became very obvious. And even though we tend to think that, it's quite different if you are a, person coming from Africa to Latin America to whatever, really it isn't. They're all new Americans. They all want to give the best to their families. They don't know how. And these organizations and grassroots groups are so critical, not only for the healthcare aspect of the life of these people, but also for workforce and economic development. So we really are discovering amazing tools. And I think the best part of all this is the partnership potential that you have to create to continue that dialogue that goes further than just simply dealing with a health problem.
A couple things that have struck me is the first is quite wonderful, which is there is a tremendous amount of will in this community to solve this problem from so many sectors. And having the will is the very first step, and that's what will get us there. The second is we are absolutely system poor, but we have to face a fact that systems don't convene themselves together, that systems only get put together, and it requires investment, both of time and of resources. And we have to really be mindful that we can't just say, hey, all you just got to work together. You just got to talk to each other, because the providers that are boots on the ground are really stretched to the limit. They are literally running as fast as they can with their heads down. And so we have to think about what does that mean in terms of next steps of developing something which may help to bring all these things together.
I echo Michelle's comments. I think we are systems poor, but I think it's more by design, by default, not necessarily by design. As Michelle mentioned before, many of our providers are putting out day-to-day fires. They're addressing crises that are happening when they're seeing people at the front door who need immediate services. And so they are inundated with trying to provide those services and sometimes don't necessarily have the time to reach across the aisle and say, I am providing a service, but we don't necessarily have these programs here. What can your organization do to help this population? I think it's going to take us also broadening our stakeholders' input and their engagement in helping to craft how we develop better systems. So talking with our funders, talking with elected officials, talking to other interested bodies, so that it's a community approach and not necessarily placing the ownership on just the services and agencies that are providing these programs.
If I could echo that for a second, when the social service providers were sitting there, as I listened to all their programs, I thought, I don't know that we need more programs, but it also came across very strong to us. These are people working very hard, and it's triage. It's everything they can do to take care of what's in front of them. They'd love to work together, but they don't have the luxury of time or the incentive that forces them together. So I echo those remarks. If you can find a way to attack that, that would be beneficial.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I was grateful for the willingness of the participants to be so honest, and as painful as their stories were, they were willing to share it. I was really touched by that. But I also walked away, recognizing what I've heard a lot about the Moms to Be program and the power of that program in the neighborhood, helping these young women. But we should be grateful for our fellow citizens for being willing to share their stories with us, because it was pretty powerful.
So now that we're deep into correcting this challenge that we've been working on, it's obvious that we are, to some degree, and it's rewarding that we are, to some degree, program rich, although lack the system. And as Marie and Sandy talked about, the coordination, the collaboration, and in some cases even the awareness of some of these programs. So that should be an area of our focus as we begin to roll up an accountability program for what it is that we're working on. So again, thanks to Sandy and Marie for all your work. And we should also thank the hundreds of community members who have engaged with us through the course of this process. witness today, the folks in attendance. I noticed as the speakers were proceeding, we were having to bring some more chairs in the back because we've had more people show up. So thanks to all of you for your engagement. In addition to which, we thank also our core team, certainly Council President Andy Ginther for getting us focused and getting us started. First Lady Karen Kasich, we appreciate your help, and Commissioner O'Grady as well. Thank you for everything you do. But we should also thank Dr. Long and her colleagues, Mashika Roberts, Nancy Bechtel, Dr. Art James, Kelly Kelleher, lots of people who have been presenting, who've been seeking feedback on what we can do to make this process a little easier. On behalf of the task force, we also thank you for your time and your attendance to these meetings and your commitment. This had to start with a commitment, and that is real, and that needs to be sustained. As we continue to move forward in implementing our plans, it's important that we keep these conversations going. We have one more formal meeting of a group this size as we move into the next phase of continuing these efforts. Our next speaker this morning will jumpstart our thinking on the collective impact and what we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks, and that is accountability. Individually, organizations can become the point person for leading 1 or 2 recommendations, but we all need to ensure that we establish community accountability for the overall results of what we've been exploring. Dr. Halfin is the director of the UCLA Center for Healthier Children, Families, and Communities, as well directs the Child and Family Health Program in the UCLA School of Public Health and the federally funded Maternal and Child Health Bureau's National Center for Infancy and Early Childhood Policy Research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Halfin.
Great pleasure. Am I on? Okay. It's a great pleasure to be with you today and, sort of parachute in from another place and not really understanding everything about the place that you're coming to. I've been trying to bone up a little bit the last couple of weeks, and last night at dinner I found out a lot more information about your city and the surrounding area, and it's been actually quite inspiring to also meet many people that are trying to do the work that you're doing. And this has also been a great setup. The diagnosis that we've just heard is the diagnosis that I hear in places that I go to all over the country about program-rich and systems poor. And what we have to realize is that every system that we have is perfectly designed to achieve the results that we get. So your system, you have a system, it's just not very well designed and not working right. And it's like an old operating system. We keep putting on more and more apps to this old operating system, and it keeps running slower and less efficient. So we have to change the operating system, and it's a redesign issue. So I'm going to talk about why infant mortality matters, life course health development matters, place, and most of what I'm going to talk about is about collective impact and how you get a system to work. I think we all know why infant mortality matters, that historically it's been an important indicator of population health and development in terms of who we are and how we're doing. It's also the conditions under which children begin life in a lifetime if they're going to be healthy. It's the tip of the iceberg. If you have high infant mortality rates, you have all kinds of other issues. And we know that disparities in infant mortality persist or are increasing, but also disparities in all kinds of other things that affect our children are increasing as well, whether it's asthma, obesity, school readiness, and the like. And so this persistent and growing inequality and lack of social mobility and other root causes are at the bottom of what we're looking at. And I go to this because of talk about life course. What we realized several years ago is that women go into different reproductive trajectories, and that African American women are actually going into a lower trajectory early on in their lives. And what we did for many, many years is we waited till they got pregnant, and we said, okay, let's change that through good prenatal care. And it was like trying to do this. It was trying to shift the whole curve at the time that they were already pregnant. It doesn't work. You can't make the kind of gains that you need. And what we started to realize is that what's pushing down on that trajectory is this lifetime of poor nutrition, stress, abuse, tobacco use, various other things in the environment in which they're living in. And so if we want to change things, you have to actually start early and try to increase the number of protective factors and reduce the risk so that we're actually changing the trajectory. This is about shifting the curve. Okay? It's about shifting the curve over a lifespan and making things very different, and investing early so that we have the kind of payoff. So, and it's also not just about health interventions, but it's about education, housing, recreation, jobs, family support, everything that goes into a community. So it's really about how do we shift these curves from ones that have lots of protective factors and little risk to those that have lots of risk and little protective factors. How do we change that? And so it's a whole life course kind of approach to this. What we know is where you live affects your health in disinvested communities and communities of opportunity, and what you see is in those different disinvested communities, you have all kinds of problems with, unsafe environments, the nutrition, everything else going on in those communities, and leads to poor health development. And in the more communities of opportunity, you have things going right. So the name of the game again is how do we turn our disinvested communities into communities of opportunity and really create the opportunities for people to be healthy, to have good nutrition, to actually achieve the kinds of things that they need to achieve. What I'm going to talk about is there are many place-based initiatives out there that are going on. And so you have things like the Harlem Children's Zone and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Thrive. There's a program we're running called TEX. There's Strive. There's the Best Baby Zones and the Magnolia Community. There's lots of what we're seeing emerging around the country are these place-based initiatives that are trying to be holistic and integrating. They're thinking about this from a whole child, whole family, whole community approach to actually shifting the curves for people. And I just want to mention the Best Baby Zone because it's one of innovative model, and we're going to hear from two areas that aren't Best Baby Zones, but are actually the inspiration for Best Baby Zones, and that's the North Manhattan and Harlem project that Mario is going to talk about, and Rebecca is going to talk about what's going on in Baltimore. But they're taking a life course perspective, it's a place-based orientation, and the program initiatives are actually trying to move the curve across the lifespan. The strategies are really picking a place and driving down deeply into those places. And by doing this in terms of changing community systems, health services, early education, economic development, and linking those together in order to change what happens in terms of birth outcomes. And so the strategy is really how do we create a culture of health? How do we actually change the health relationships in those communities? And what it realizes also is that everybody has to be part of it. It's not something that's just for the health sector or education, this is a community-wide approach in which everyone needs to be part, and everybody needs to be learning their way forward. So we're seeing these 3 pilot zones that are going on, and we'll hear more from Harlem and from Baltimore in a bit. The lessons learned, and this was what was the great setup for me in terms of looking around the country, is it's not about producing, it's about producing better health, not just about better health care. And if we're going to produce better health, it's more than better health care. It's not about the services and programs, but it's about the systems. So, great setup for me, but we have to embrace the complexity that we're actually dealing with. Communities are complex, growing, developing ecologies. We need to not think that we can approach them as if there's a linear, simple, one silver bullet that's going to sort of take care of things. And so you also need to think about if you're going to move forward, you need to scale the change that's needed. So you have to work at scale. You have to work at a community level. You can't just do program by program or else you're just replicating the problem again. So how do you work at scale? And what we know about complex systems is complex systems learn their way forward. And what I mean by that is that if you have WIC and education and early childhood services and family supports and healthcare, they all have to be learning together in a virtuous cycle together and learning their way forward. or else you don't get this kind of system change. Businesses understand it. They create continuous quality improvement systems. Those are learning systems about learning your way forward within a corporation or a business. We have to do the same. So the way that I think about it, there are all kinds of models of how you do this in communities. So there are partnership models, asset-based models, power relation models, but part of what we don't get is that communities are complex. So in any community, there's lots of individual programs that exist that are trying to improve healthy development. So you have health services and family support and various kinds of things. And they're connected to all kinds of community-based levels organizations. So you have your schools and your child care centers and your WIC sites and your churches and various other things. And they're connected to what's going on in the city and county departments. The problem is we have funding streams that make people act in certain ways that are very narrow and siloed and create us from cooperating and collaborating. And this creates services that can't cooperate and collaborate either. But this is like one big whirling vortex, okay? This is like a big weather pattern in which everything is sort of bouncing off of each other. And if the kids or the women get the right services, it's more like an accident. It's like a pinball thing that they're getting it rather than by design. So we're not designing this to work right. And if we want it to work right, we have to bring our city and county departments into alignment. They need to be aligned in what they're doing across all the agencies, or it ain't going to work. You have to have the community organizations start to work as a network so that they're not all working independently, doing their own thing. And so that way you get pathways and a user interface that works for families, and so that people can find their way to do what they need. And so what this means is you have to have some kind of learning system for collective impact. And it has to be a learning system that's collaborative, inclusive, it's motivational for everybody that's participating, and it's transformative. And those are design principles that you put into what you're trying to do. So when you go into any community, you have all these services. These are all the services. And again, we know that if mothers have a civil engineering degree and a social work degree, they'll probably get what they need, right? And most of your mothers have those. No, we know that they don't have those degrees, right? So they're never going to find their way to this. So part of what we want to do is how do we start aligning these sectors and allow them to work together? So how do we bring early care and education, health, family support, child welfare, and you can go on in terms of the sectors. So you have to have a common agenda that we're working towards, whether it's infant mortality, school readiness. What I think you were trying to do is you're trying to get healthy development for everybody in the community. It has to be something that's more universal that schools can buy into. Schools aren't in the infant mortality business, but they are in the healthy development business. Child welfare isn't in infant mortality, but they are in healthy development. So if we want to align ourselves, we have to have a common outcome and a simple way of thinking about getting there. Then you have to have shared data and things that you're going to try to improve together. If I'm the health guy and you're the WIC person and you're the early education person, we can't work on our own outcomes. We have to work on common outcomes. Because if you want accountability across sectors, we have to be working on the same outcome. And then you need some kind of collaborative improvement or learning system. The way that Toyota or IBM or any company does, they have a system that everybody's working no matter where you're at, and they're moving and driving together. And then you need financial and policy alignment. So this is kind of a formula. If you want to get alignment across sectors and you want a system to start working, you have to have an alignment strategy. You also have to have a measurement strategy. So if, in fact, we're trying to improve trajectories over the lifespan, I'm just showing the first 5 years of life, we need to be connecting our birth certificate data, pediatric assessment data, preschool assessments, school readiness, and on and on. So because we manage what we measure, you have to measure trajectories, because that's what we're trying to do. When we have the data to do it, you just have to combine it and connect it up and move it in this direction. So we're doing this, and I'm going to show you an example. We're using something called the Early Development Inventory, or Early Development Instrument, and it's a measure of school readiness. It's a measure of the health of your entire population of children in age 5, and they're the canaries in the coal mine. Basically, if your children are doing great at age 5, they're likely to continue on and do well. And so what we're doing is measuring their social, emotional, language, physical, and communication skills. So it's a holistic measure of healthy development of kids. And we're mapping it neighborhood by neighborhood. Okay? So we have maps of how kids, this is Orange County, California, and the dark green are where we have lots of vulnerability on these measures, but we're able to look neighborhood by neighborhood at how children are doing. And I'm showing you this as an example because if you want neighborhoods to come together, you have to have measures that bring them together that everybody can focus on. And you have to have it at a neighborhood level, not at a zip code level, because we don't live in our zip codes. We live in our neighborhoods. Because if I'm going to hold up a mirror to a neighborhood, they have to be able to see themselves in that neighborhood because it has to be about them. And when you bring the data to a neighborhood level, what it does is it makes it a problem you can deal with. So if we know for Greater Columbus that 20 kids died last year in car accidents, we have that data, it doesn't make us do anything really different. Statistic with a tier associated with it. But if we know at 4th and Livingston, on a specific street corner that 2 kids died there in the last 6 months, we're going to work to put the people in that neighborhood will put a speed bump or put change the signals or do something. So we have to make it real and bring it down to a level. And we have the abilities to do that. Question is, how do we go ahead and do it? And we're doing this, and then you can map all kinds of things. You can map your infant mortality, your poverty. You can bring this together, and people start to see that things are connected. You can't get people to work on connected agendas unless they see how they're connected. So this is just looking in the same parts of Orange County, and we've now mapped all of Orange County, and you're mapping the poverty rates and the preschool rates, and we can map infant mortality and child abuse. And you start to get this rich texture, and you start to be able to tell a story about what's actually going on in my neighborhood. And what we're doing is we're taking data and turning it into information because it's making a difference in what people are doing. And what we're really trying to do is turn that information into currency. We're trying to make it valuable. And these maps become like $20 bills in these communities, right? Because they have value, because the community can come together and say, this is who we are, this is what we want to do, this is why we need to change. And so they have value. So if we want to go from having data, you have lots of data here. How do you turn that data into information, and then how do you make it into currency so that it has exchange value? How do you create a market for that data? We're working all over the country right now doing this kind of work. And I just show you this, but there's lots of places just trying to measure and map and change what's going on for their kids. Now I'm going to finish by talking about one particular community that we're working with in Los Angeles. It's called Magnolia Place. It's the Magnolia Community Initiative. It's a part of Los Angeles. If you know Los Angeles, it's where the 10 and 110 freeway intersect. It's about 100,000 people live in this area. Los Angeles Unified School District. And what they decided was they weren't going to build just a super duper preschool or a great, boutique educare center, family program that would serve 2,000 kids in that neighborhood. But they said, how do we work at scale? We've got 35,000 kids here. How do we start shifting the curve for all 35,000 kids? And so there's 6 hubs in the Magnolia Community Initiative, and these hubs have child care and health care and Head Start and early Head Start and home visiting. So they're centers of community change and service provision. They don't have everything, but they're connected to everything. And so they provide an anchor in each one of the neighborhoods in terms of what's going on. There's 71 partner organizations that are working, and they're all learning with each other. There's 100 different community groups. There's now creating 500 block advocates to sort of move the process forward when there's 14,000 families. And so what they're doing is measuring what's going on. And so here are the EDI scores. This is looking at children's social competence. Dark green being where the social competence, where you have risk of 20 or 30% of the kids that are vulnerable in terms of their social competence. And what's mapped over that is the maternal depression rates in pink. So we know in this dark green area down in South Central, we have high social competence problems. We have very high maternal depression. What this does is it brings the early childhood people, the mental health people, the healthcare people, other people in the community, say, how do we deal with the fact that we have kids that aren't thriving and mothers that have depression? So how do we start changing this? Because these are root causes. And maternal depression is right at the center of infant mortality and everything else you're going to come up against. And so how do we begin to change that? That's a key thing. But the fact is we're measuring and mapping it at a level and bringing and driving the sectors together to begin to align about doing things together. What Magnolia does is they set certain goal targets. So the eventual goal is a kid thriving, going to high school graduation, low levels of child abuse. The intermediate outcomes here are the number of children that are vulnerable on the EDI, the third grade reading scores, food security. These are longer term outcomes. And the short term goal targets are what we're working on a daily basis. So part of what we do is sort of set outcome goals, short-term, medium, and long-term outcomes. And these become the dashboard that the whole community is shooting towards. And what we came up with is practice drivers. How do we change things? How do I change things on the WIC site, the healthcare site? How do we develop cross-sector pathways? How do we improve flow of service and information? How do we increase the effectiveness of supports? How do we make sure that everybody feels like they belong in this community? And then how do we change leadership and culture? And so these are the drivers that people are working on and experimenting with around maternal depression. If we want to improve developmental screening rates that are incredibly low, how do we make that happen? It's not just going to the pediatricians and saying, you got to do a better job and here are better tools to doing this and we'll show you how to do it. But it's getting the WIC sites to teach parents that they should ask for a developmental screening and giving them a card so when they walk into the doctor's office they say, I need a developmental screen for my kid. It's getting the preschool to ask for the developmental screen. So you're creating flow and demand so that the doctors are doing it because people are demanding it and needing what they're doing, not just sort of working with their system and their program. And so working across sectors. So what this sets up is this is a logic model. It's a driver diagram. And most companies that do quality improvement, this is what they do. They set up driver diagrams and then they work across the organization to do that. And so we're using data to drive our processes around how do we change care, how do we make our systems function, how do we measure our population outcomes. Community comes together just like what you're doing here, and they're working and they're putting up storyboards and they're talking about how are we changing things. So it's how do you move from your concern and your diagnosis and knowing what to do to knowing how to do it and working together and creating a learning system so that everybody's moving forward. We have dashboards that we use, just the same way that Hewlett-Packard or Apple or Toyota uses a dashboard to sort of say how do we meet our goals. We have at the top third grade reading. We want that to be better, what we're not doing so well. These are the EDI scores. This is the risk factors and protective factors. We want results-based accountability. Those are our results at the top, and here's our accountability. We're actually measuring month by month what's going on with parents, with our services. Are we screening for depression better? That's going up. Are parents all being asked, no matter what service they come into, do you have concerns about your children's development? And if you do, can I connect you with the right place? So there's no wrong door. There's a single point of entry. It's not in one place. It's distributed. But we're changing and creating, as we were hearing about, the navigators and the integrator that create a system that actually makes the system work. And we're using the data to drive that. And we're using the data in the communities with the residents so that they own the data and they're using it in ways to organize. So the recipe that we're using is we're using evidence-based programs. We have these change concepts and logic models that we're using and working on this and doing active experimentation, these plan, do, study, act improvement models. So we're constantly changing and learning from each other. And we have these move the dot sessions so that we're moving the dot on these things and measuring and coming together and seeing that. So imagine you're coming back here and you have data on several neighborhoods and you're sitting here and you're saying, how are we moving the dot and how are we learning together and how are we going to make this happen? And we hold ourselves accountable. We go back to our organizations and we come back and we do the work. So back to the system of chaos and how do we get alignment. So if we're going to get alignment and create a learning system that optimizes outcomes, you have to have some kind of an alignment strategy and some kind of initiative that's driving it and an integrator that's bringing it together. And the Magnolia Community Initiative is an integrator. Okay? It's serving the integration functions. You need some kind of integrated network and a driver and logic that's going to make you work as a system and work together and create momentum. You need to have data and analytics that create the kind of currency you need that's going to flow across the system, because you have to have data that's going to connect, that's flowing top to bottom and across. This is what's the connecting. We're creating a marketplace. And then you have to have an adaptive, flexible, high-performing set of services, and you have to drive towards doing this. So what I'm laying out are there's tools, there's design ideas, there's system design around doing this in communities, and a set of tools that are being developed to do this kind of work. So the lessons, you need to understand the system, complexity, its path it's on, and its development, and how do you change the path and development. You need to develop a common framework, roadmap, goals, language, purpose, and metrics. What I would recommend is you put some kind of roadmap that says this is what we want to happen in Columbus in 5 years or 10 years. And then we're going to backstage our way to where we're at now, and this is what people are going to be doing. And we're going to come back to that roadmap every year as we do this kind of process. That's what technology companies do. That's what communities that actually make change do. Don't just think about the next year, but where do you want to get to? If we're sitting here in 2020 or 2025, what are the successes that we're talking about, and how are we going to get there? Design an adaptive network for not for an institution, but for a system. Cultivate leadership at all levels and in all sectors to serve as connectors, mavens, and inspirers. Openly create a commons with an open door so that this is something, a common framework, a commons that everybody's connecting to. Value being adaptive, emergent, and resourceful, and realizing that you need a long-term vision. This is going to take time. It's not going to happen in 3 years. It doesn't happen on foundation, 3 or 5 year grants. This is a 10-year or 20-year process. And there are plenty of places where they've made the investment, making the change, doing this, and you're seeing the change happen. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
And happy to take questions, or hopefully I've been provocative a bit, so that you'll say, but wait,
Any questions for Dr. Halpin?
And I'm very hard of hearing, so please speak up for me.
So I just wanted to, 6 hubs, 71 agencies, the money. Where did this, how did you pull the money together? Was this state money? Was this county money?
Right.
Where was the money from?
So if you look at in each of these places, the financing's different. And the good news, I'll say, is there is a lot of interest right now of linking community development, community finance kinds of stuff that banks are doing with health development, community development, children's development. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco and most of the Federal Reserves are getting into this and looking at this. So there's different financing that's on the rise, and people are thinking about doing this in different ways. The Magnolia Community Initiative is LA's version of the Harlem Children's Zone, except what they're doing is they're doing this on about about $1 million a year budget for the entire initiative, okay? Which is very different than the Harlem Children's Zone, okay? And the difference is the way that it's organized. It's actually being organized in a way so that it's like one big soccer team. Everybody's on the field and learning from each other. It's sort of like a big pickup soccer game, and everybody's doing this. And it doesn't have, it's not like an NFL, we're going to pour a lot of money and have a big quarterback, throw the passes to everybody in that way. So it's a different kind of model. So they're trying to take what they've got and make it work better, connect up everything and do that. And that doesn't cost all that much. And you have a lot of money already in your system, and if you get your organizations to start thinking what happens, you're going to get efficiencies out of this once you start to do this. I do a lot of work in quality improvement. People say, well, we can't do this. And they do a little bit of quality improvement. They start to see efficiencies immediately, and they start to see that they're saving money. So you can do this for not much. You know, it takes some investment, but it doesn't take a big investment.
Who's convening and driving Magnolia?
I'm sorry?
Who's convening and driving Magnolia?
Well, it all depends in these different areas. It's different groups. The Magnolia Community Initiative was brought together by the Children's Bureau, which was a very venerable children's organization like the Children's Aid Society. They brought it together with 4 sort of co-conveners that are helping them do that. UCLA is playing a role. The County of Los Angeles is playing a role. The city's playing a role. And there are a few other organizations. So they're serving as the backbone functions. It's not one backbone organization. So you hear this collective impact, you need the backbone, and oftentimes they're saying you need a backbone organization. Yes, you can have one organization try to drive it, and we're seeing that happen where a children's hospital will be the driver and organizing it, or the United Way will be the driver, or it can be a coalition. You need these backbone functions, the way that you do it. And basically, all of us are learning our way forward. I was mentioning last night, we're working with 10 cities right now that are really doing deep work around this early childhood. And they're all learning from each other because this is all new territory. This community-wide, place-based, integrated approaches from a complex system standpoint is a new way of approaching this. So we all have to be learning from each other because none of us have all the answers. What I'm showing you is what's happening in one place. Seems to be working. People are coming together, keep coming to the table. We're moving the dot on stuff. But we're coming together now with Hartford and Tulsa and New Orleans and Miami that are all doing the same things, you know, and you guys could be part of that learning community. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. You want to be, this is a collective impact, crowdsourcing. We got to use our collective intelligence, you know, across places and learn from each other to move this thing forward.
Well, thank you very much. You've really given us a map, if you will. You've talked about developing a learning system. You've talked about the importance of alignment, agreeing on common metrics, important metrics that we'll work toward. Now, we know, and we'll talk about this later in the meeting, that we have quite a number of communities within Columbus that need this effort. You talked about one specific project, the Magnolia Project, one community, but there's going to be a great pressure on our group, on this effort, to apply lessons learned across a broad number of communities. Would your advice be focus, focus? Would your advice be you can if you have the appropriate alignment? What would you tell us?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I showed you one community of 100,000 people in a city. We're actually doing in lots of parts of Los Angeles and different cities. I think you have to work across and go deep in some places because you have to go into some neighborhoods deeply so you can learn what to do and learn your process. And then, because if you're going to spread it to other places, you're going to have to go deep in 2, 3, 4 neighborhoods. But the important issue also here, and someone was mentioning this before, when we do the EDI measurement across a whole city, what you'll find is the poor neighborhoods look pretty bad, right? You'll have 30% of the kids being vulnerable in those poor neighborhoods. You go to the middle class neighborhoods, they have about 15% of their kids vulnerable. Go to the rich neighborhoods, it's about 10% of their kids vulnerable. When you lay it all out, what you start to see is, yes, our poor communities look pretty bad, but where the most kids that are vulnerable are actually in our middle class areas. And what that does is very important. It becomes, this is not about those people and other people's kids. It's about all of our children. And if we're going to move towards some kind of progressive kind of universalism, we need to be able to recognize that this is about improving the trajectories of lots of kids. Right now in the United States, we have about 30 to 40% of children that are going into low trajectories. And the majority of those kids are, the greatest concentration are in poor communities. Clearly that's the case. But what you see is actually the majority of those kids are in middle-class homes. So this becomes about all of our kids. And I think that makes it not just an us-them kind of an approach.
We've seen some of that data. I'm looking at Janet Jackson and the United Way when she shared with us the data on children across our communities who access free lunches. And we're so surprised when we look at what we consider to be more affluent communities and find the large proportion, and I bet those are some of those same children you're talking about who have the EDI issues as well.
And what we're also seeing is that you'll see in some poor areas, you'll see that the EDI scores look very good. And you'll say, well, why is that? Okay, and they have more preschools, they have library programs, literacy programs. You start to see, well, this is why this area doesn't look as bad. You'll see some areas, like in the Orange County map, there was one area that has very low poverty and horrible EDI scores. And they have no preschools in that area. It's a transitional area in terms of residential mobility. There's no social cohesion. So there's reasons why these things are happening. But unless you have data and holding the mirror up to yourself, you don't know what's going on. And it takes some time to do this. You have to identify the communities. It's not a zip code thing. I want to get away from, people living, we think about that because that's an easy way to organize things. It's not a zip code thing. It's a neighborhood community thing. It's where people identify where they live. Yeah.
EDI data is the first question.
I'm sorry?
The EDI data, is that a big deal to gather that?
Well, the way that it's being done, and we learned about this from our Canadian colleagues because they developed this about 10, 12 years ago, and now it's spread across Canada. And it's now, and the Australians picked it up, and they do the entire country, all 290,000 kindergartners. What it's done is it's a measure that kindergarten teachers fill out on kids after the kids have been in kindergarten for 2 to 3 months. So it's done usually in January of the kindergarten year, and it takes about 10 minutes per kid, and it's a checklist of 105 questions that are filled out. So it's very easy to do. Schools do it, and then what we're finding is schools then not only use the data to change what they're doing population-wise for their kids, but it helps the schools start to think about, why are we having 20, 30% of the kids not ready, and what do we do to work with the communities to do it? So it's been a school-community partnership around it.
Thank you for that. The second question, is there a natural chronology for doing this? Is there a typical first or second step that you've seen in various communities around the country that just gets the process started correctly?
I think the chronology is thinking about what your roadmap is, where you want to get to. Thinking about the design of what it's going to take you to do that, and the kinds of features, and then figuring out, which communities you're going to dive deep into, and what that's going to look like, and what metrics you're going to use, and how you're going to do it, and then what things you're going to do across, and to figure out. But you have to work, I think, deeply in some areas, and you have to work across. The example I gave you, of the, improving developmental screening, which was just rock bottom in these parts of Los Angeles, 16% of kids, 10% of kids getting the developmental screening. And I've seen, because I've studied this, you can get the developmental screening rates up to 70%, and then they just drop down once you take the supports out. And so we were able to get them up and keep them there by aligning the WIC and the early childhood education. But the WIC people live in a WIC world, so you have to get the county-wide WIC to sort of say, you know what, we need to work on developmental screening also. So how do we do that county-wide? We got to get all the preschools to say, hey, you know what, we need those developmental screening things. So you have to, as you're working deeply, you have to think about what are going to be some of the key change strategies that we do citywide or countywide also. And you can pick them off and start and work on them. You don't do everything at once. But you do it in such a way that you pick things off so that you can have successes and you can learn your way forward and you see yourselves moving that. thing that brings people back to meetings is watching the dot move and learning from each other and seeing things change.
So in terms of watching the dot move, we need to have the meeting move along.
All right.
Very pragmatic. Very practical advice. Couple of takeaways for me. It's not a zip code thing, important, and we're not going to try and reinvent the wheel here. So thank you, Dr. Halfin. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask the task force to form two groups, the left and the right side of the room, to discuss what we've learned here and to get a better understanding of how we begin to put these pieces together. It's important that we hear from two experts, one from Baltimore, one from Northern Manhattan. And you got to hear these statistics before these two leaders come up. Baltimore has made tremendous gains in their effort. They've realized a decrease of 28% since they launched their plan in 2009. During the same time, they reduced the disparity between black and white infants by almost 40%. Impressive numbers. In Northern Manhattan, the Perinatal Partnership has been a leader in driving down their infant mortality rates in Central Harlem, principally from a high of 27.7 per 1,000 live births in 1990 to 7.5 deaths per live births in 7.5 out of 1,000. So let me repeat that again. They've gone from 27.7 per 1,000 to 7.5 per 1,000. One of the principles behind the success in Baltimore is Ms. Rebecca Deneen, the Assistant Health Commissioner for Maternal and Child Health, and widely viewed as a leading national expert for infant mortality reduction and maternal and child health care, as well as a leader in innovative Northern Manhattan Perinatal Partnership. We're also pleased to have with us Mario Drummonds. Mario and Rebecca are going to address us for a few minutes, and then we're going to break into these groups and talk about that and what we learned from Dr. Halfin. Rebecca and Mario.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah, okay. First of all, I'm just looking around this room, and I think, boy, Baltimore would benefit so much from the tremendous senior-level leadership that is showing here and the way that your process is so transparent by inviting the public. I really applaud that. Ours has been a very different sort of approach in some ways. I mean, we have senior level leadership involved, but it's been a lot of grassroots kind of working, and I'll walk through. Now, I'm talking from the health department's point of view. I'm humbled by the colleagues I'm with. Dr. Halfin was somebody that when I was working in Baltimore, I started working there in 2008. I called with my former health commissioner, Dr. Halfin, to just try to get some nuggets of wisdom, and to be next to Mario, who's done such tremendous work. Honestly, I hope that I can share something that's useful for all of you. The first thing I would think of, I'm just going to share sort of 9 big things that we thought about in Baltimore. And probably the first thing is we had already an infant mortality task force. It was mostly middle managers that were thinking about infant mortality from health sector and private sector. And they were funded through Robert Wood Johnson Leadership in Action program to think about infant mortality. And they came up with this very long laundry list of recommendations, which were very relevant. And that was what I sort of came into at the time. And it just felt very overwhelming. You have this just such enormously complex issue, which has modifiable determinants, but really is rooted in social determinants. It's really about the whole life course of a family. How do you actually even make any? What do you even do? What do you start with? And so the first thing we did was just understand our data as well as possible. I didn't have an epidemiologist. I hired an epidemiologist. We didn't have really, really strong data people in the health department. We just made it happen through some funding from Care First. Started to think about how do we rethink through our staff to get the right people to help us to just frame our problem. It sounds like you all have done such a really good job with that. So it's both from the quantitative, so we knew the science, we knew the best practices, we knew there was at least 12 high-impact areas that we could be addressing. So it wasn't the science so much as what is happening in Baltimore, both from the perspective of our infant mortality data, and then from the perspective of what do residents want, what do they think about, who are they, who's our audience, what are our health providers thinking about, what are our frontline staff thinking about. And so it became quite a task, and we now have a birth profile, infant sleep death profile. That's our dashboard for our work. The city commissioner now has a dashboard of indicators that the city mayor has a dashboard of indicators that we report on quarterly to her related to our work, but it came out of a lot of thinking through what is Baltimore City's data. And a professor at Johns Hopkins University said to me, he said, look, you're just look at the rate. He said you can either reduce the number of deaths, or you can reduce the number of births, or you can reduce the number of preterm births and low birth weight babies. That's really what you have to think about. And that actually simplified things for me a lot. And the number of deaths, our leading causes were infants, low birth weight and preterm birth, followed by sleep-related deaths, followed by congenital abnormalities. That's not the same numbers that fall for the U.S. in general. So we knew there were a lot of modifiable things that could happen in Baltimore. Most particularly was our unsafe sleep deaths. There weren't a lot of SIDS cases. There were a lot of cases of undetermineds, and that told us that we could examine things to figure out what was going on. And so we started there, but we used a framework which Dr. Halfon has really talked through, and that's sort of my second point is, first of all, we said we need to look upstream and downstream. You can't just think about this from one perspective. So we'll take sleep and make a change there, but in the meantime, we need to think about the fact that early childhood education and family literacy, the trauma that the city has experienced, race and racism and housing are major factors. And so we now, as we've worked through our program, we have 9 active coalitions. 5 of them deal with modifiable issues, 4 of them deal with these more social determinant issues. So it's sort of always maintaining a balance between doing things and making differences on your dashboard to talking about real issues, trust issues, things that people don't want to talk about at the table, raising those issues up. We always think about our work in terms of 4 levels of implementation, and I think Dr. Halfon talked about that very well. So there's the supply side of our service delivery. Is it integrated? Do we have single point of entry into all of our home visiting programs, into all of our work in early childhood? Is the system aligned? We have, are all our 7 birthing hospitals giving the same education, for example, in safe sleep? And then we think about our demand side, and we think about how do we generate people. It doesn't matter if every single provider is aligned if you don't have people who use the healthcare system for some reason or another. So is your supply side actually meeting people where they are? Are you using the hours of service that allow people to be employed? Are you allowing, are your early Head Start services all day and not half day? Are you thinking about things that allow people to be met where they are so that their health needs can be met? Are you working with laundromats, grocery stores, barbershops, and that sort of thing? So we think a lot about how do you meet people where they are. The balance between doing community level work, since we're a city of 695,000 people, we can't pour money into certain communities because we have to balance the population of Baltimore. That's our needle that we're trying to move. And so we have 3 very, very strong hub communities where what we use is our learning centers. And we do a lot of, this is where we learn a lot about our community demand and our demand generation strategies and how do we reach out to people. We take our fetal and infant mortality review, we come up with generic cases for that, and then we bring it to the community for people to talk about what happened in certain cases of infant death, what might you have done at a neighborhood level, and then how can we transform that into community mobilization. So we learn from our communities, but then we're always thinking about the whole city, about all 7 birthing hospitals, about our 9 federally qualified health centers, and so on. I guess the only couple of other things I'd want to say is I do think we spend a lot of time educating funders. We can't work with year-long cycles. You can't work with siloed funding. Money has to be basketed, and we have had a really good leadership around getting money to be in one place so that we can all draw from it. I think the umbrella, we really felt that branding our initiative around the city was very important. So Be More for Healthy Babies is a call out. Our call out line is every baby counts on you. So it counts on you, policymaker, counts on you, mom, counts on you, service delivery provider. But it also counts on people letting their egos stay at the door. And so we have our set of partnership principles, and one of the most important ones is egos stay at the door, which means that, yes, your logo may show up on something, but it may not, because really this is about Be More for Healthy Babies, and this is about a whole Baltimore citywide initiative. Then it's very important that people are about the work and the numbers and how we use our data in a more effective way. And finally, leadership. I mean, I think it's really important to underscore. I mean, I've gone through 4 health commissioners in my time and 4 steering committee leaders since I started in 2008. And so you have to think about who are the people who may be staying longer term in work and how you make sure that they're thinking out of the box and not sort of rotely. And so we've been doing recently in Maternal and Child Health Bureau, I have all of my supervisors being trained in mindfulness and how you take care of yourself and how you think about resilience in a different kind of way so that we can start to get a set of leaders who are going to be able to meet clients where they are and think about things differently. So.
Good morning, everyone. How's everybody doing? The first thing I would like to do is just really thank Dr. Robbins and Dr. James for allowing me to come and share our experiences in New York City with all of you here in Columbus. I am so humbled just to be here today and just to see all of the folks in the room and to see all of the stakeholders at the table who want to make change. And that's really, really exciting to me. My colleague talked about 9 points. I only have 5 points in my elevator speech. So I'm going to move forward. And I'm losing my voice. I have a little cold. The first point that I wanted to talk about that was so important in our campaign over an 18-year period was the focus, and Neil talked about it earlier, it was the focus initially on data, right? There has to be a robust data mining operation in terms of trying to study each one of the communities, 3 or 4 or 5 communities I understand that you're talking about here in Columbus, to understand the psychographics, the metrics, the problems, but not just look at problems, but look at the assets in those communities also, because you're going to want to utilize those assets to actually drive change once the implementation schemes start to roll out. So data mining, and not just looking at infant mortality, the 4 variables that we focused on the health sector are preterm birth, infant mortality, low birth weight rates, and entering into prenatal care in the first trimester. That's your data set around your core business area. But at the same time, we want to look at school readiness data, we want to look at poverty data, we want to look at crime data. We want to find out where the stars align. And then once you do that analysis, focus your programmatic interventions, your strategy work there. So that's point number 1. Do a good job, but don't study forever. Sooner or later, the ship is going to have to move out of the port. And what I find in a lot of these broad initiatives is there's just 1 or 2 or 3 years of study and design, and the ship never moves out. And just don't get caught up in that inertia. Sooner or later, you got to learn by doing. Number 2. For us in Harlem and my board and the collective leadership that was on the ground in Harlem, we broadcast real broad, audacious goals. We wanted to really say, in the next 15 to 20 years, we was going to make dramatic changes in these 4 areas of clinical practice. Some movements might say, you know something, maybe we should be a little careful. I like what you guys are doing here in Columbus. But as you set these goals, you need to have benchmarks along the way. Just like in any private sector corporation, you got to monitor, year by year, how closely you're getting to these outcomes, and maybe change strategy and change implementation schemes on a dime if you're not getting the outcomes incrementally that you should be getting to get down to the levels that you want. So definitely set big big goals, but at the same time, there has to be a monitoring function, on a regular basis. And later on, maybe when we get to committee level, we'll talk. I have a graph of a committee structure that will be responsible for actually monitoring that type of work. Number 3, which is the biggest area for me, and I come from the private sector, and what I learned in the private sector, in any good private sector corporation, is that strategy is everything. What you decide to invest in, the choices that the firm makes in terms of what it does and what it invests in are so critical. And when I came to the public sector, it didn't seem like a lot of the hospital systems and a lot of the private organizations never really invested a lot of time in thinking about strategy. But colleagues, strategy, as a lot of you in this room know, is so critical to this work. Because number one, we don't have an unlimited supply of resources, right? We have to make choices in terms of where to invest and what to do. Strategies, number one, should be subversive. They should upset how the industry is operating, so you can be distinctive and different in the marketplace. Strategies should also tell you, as a coalition, what you should not be doing, right? Because now you're pushing out resources and funds into areas that's not going to achieve results. Strategies are tied to the problem analysis, right? Whatever you define in that problem stage and in that asset mapping stage is going to inform strategy, right? Strategy should not sit on the shelf. I see it in a lot of nonprofits. They do a lot of work around strategy development, and the strategic plan sits on the shelf. Strategies have to be executed. Strategies have to be measured on a regular basis to see if they actually are working, so you might have to change in mid-course if things are not moving. And then finally, colleagues, strategies decay. The customer segment changes, the environment, regulatory issues move, and then you as an organization or as a movement is going to have to change your strategies, maybe in 4 or 5 years. Looking at our own agency, when I give you an example, we focused on pregnant women very much in the first 5 or 6 years of our campaign. And then the data, the research started coming in that we needed to focus more on women who were not pregnant, who had previous adverse pregnancy outcomes, and we switched our whole focus in terms of doing more work with interconceptional care and preconceptional care women. Number 4, and I think I got a few more minutes left. Colleagues, there's been a lot of talk about working in different sectors, and I think it's so important. We in the health sector are so used to just working in the health environment. But for this to work on a local level, and it's been talked about in earlier discussions today, you have to, as health economists or as health workers, you have to move into the community development sector. You actually have to move in the early childhood development sector. You really have to merge programmatic activities to get, that's where the value comes in, right? Just doing work in the health sector is not enough. You've got to really be able to actually jump and leap other sectors. And then, of course, from an ecological perspective, you're going to have to work on the individual level, you're going to have to work on the group level, you're going to have community-wide strategies, you're going to have systems building strategies, as well as you have to work on the policy level. And later on, we'll get into that. And then finally, colleagues, my colleague ended on the question of leadership. But besides strategy, leadership is everything, right? Leaders really are the individuals that transform organizations, right? They have a vision and they live in the future, but at the same time, they're dealing with the day-to-day of the present. What leaders basically do, colleagues, is take the assets that they're given today in the form of people, structure, and finance, and make those assets more valuable tomorrow. So as you begin this journey, you need to think about who your leadership team is, how committed they are. We are here just coming from the outside. We're going to go back to our hometowns, and you guys are going to have the awesome responsibility to redirect the ship of state towards a new direction, and we'll be here to support you. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, I am going to take some creative license here because we've got a lot of good information. We were going to break into groups. What I'm going to ask that, I'm going to create a little panel here, and guess who's on the panel? And I apologize that I won't be able to see you, but you guys can hear me, okay?
Feel your spirit.
Thank you. So I want you to be able to ask questions, but I want to jumpstart this because, you know, our focus is on models. So I want to take the next 15 minutes because we've got a very interesting presentation on the heat map that I really want to make sure we get to, so I'm going to move some things around. So I'm going to jump in here with the first question, because what we want to make sure we get at are the commonalities and the differences. You know, you will have witnessed 3 models, and to start thinking about where they're alike, where they're different, why they're different. So my first question, in our community, we've learned that there are many different organizations and entities working to reduce infant mortality or related risk, but that this work is often done in silos. In your respective communities, how have you fostered and supported collaboration and the development of shared agenda? We'll start with you, Rebecca.
Okay. Well, the first thing is we did write a strategy to improve birth outcomes in Baltimore City. That was called SIBO before we had Be More for Healthy Babies. And that strategy we wrote with a lot of different partners and then vetted through probably a 2-month process where we took the strategy to all of our political leaders, we took the strategy to all of our service providers, and that we have our service providers tiered. So we have tier 1 of obstetric, pediatric, family medical practice providers who are all supported by their nurses and social workers. That's our tier 1 because we know they're touching people right in the period that we may have the closest association with them. And then tier 2 are providers that are like the Department of Social Services, which I guess is, you know, your equivalent, I think, probably have a Department of Social Services, our community schools, particularly our early childhood people. We took it to our recreation and parks people. We took it to sort of all of the tier 2 people who touch the same population of people, but maybe not directly because of health-related reasons. And then our tier 3 were all of our community-based providers. And that was a set of, they all vetted the strategy in these open forums, much like what you have right here. And then finally we brought in community groups and had evening sessions where we'd serve spaghetti and sort of, you know, have sessions where we talk about the strategy. So that's how we got initial buy-in, but we spent a lot of time then taking, we had some funding from Care First. We were blessed with that. We got $1 million from Care First to start thinking about how do we put together a branding strategy, a way of like bringing people together through a brand, and that's where we came up with Be More for Healthy Babies. And that too was vetted through a series of different groups. But it was basically making sure that everybody's voices was heard and that we had immediate feedback to people and made the changes that were necessary within our strategy that reflected what people had to say. We spent a lot of time, I just want to emphasize this, with frontline service providers. We weren't just looking at sort of who are the managers, but who's the home visitor and are they reading this and does it make sense to them? Because it is absolutely useless for us to talk, for me to talk about, we need to align funding. If my home visiting provider doesn't know, that's not going to necessarily be meaningful to them. They need to know what to do differently in their work that's going to change things. And so it's sort of, how do you get the meat onto what are incredibly important, powerful, abstract ideas? And so we used our frontline service providers and then our community residents a lot to try to get the meat on the work.
How do you guys handle this?
Well, what we had to do was we created a foreign policy. In New York City, there's so many neighborhoods, and I'm using political terminology to try to answer your question. We were working feverishly in Harlem, but we always knew if we was going to really have collective impact, we needed to create a citywide movement around infant mortality in New York City. And so around the 911 incident, of course, that was a real tough period for all New Yorkers in that period. I had an idea that we could create political space at our city council and with our mayor, Mayor Giuliani at the time, a Republican mayor, that we can create a citywide movement and take the lessons learned that we were doing in Harlem and reproduce them across the city. And so what we decided to do was we created a citywide coalition to end infant mortality. We created a nonprofit called FCN that would be our management agent in terms if we got city funds to funnel those funds through 40 to 50 community-based organizations across the city. And then we instituted a massive media campaign in New York City around black and brown babies dying all throughout the city. Mayor Giuliani and his leadership at first ignored our media push, but the campaign was so ferocious that he had to respond. And he responded with $7.5 million in city tax levy funds that went to all of our 40 groups around the city. And of course, we had a state health department match to those resources. And that started in 2001. From 2001 till today, we've raised close to $120 million in city tax levy funds going towards infant mortality. And no longer this movement just became a Harlem movement. This movement became a political, social movement throughout New York City.
That's phenomenal. I like that concept of foreign policy.
Rebecca, did you have one more thing that I think really built this shared agenda that I was remiss in not saying before, which is that we know that infant safe sleep is like the tip of the iceberg. If for us there was 29 deaths and then we got it down to 14 and then it was, 16 and then 15, 14. And so no is that the greatest shakes in the world? No, but it did actually start to reduce our overall infant mortality rate and started to reduce the Maryland state rate. Now what that did though was everybody in all of those tiers actually had a role. So suddenly the Department of Social Service could put up a video that we had created in their centers. Suddenly the school system could talk to their young people who had younger siblings about a particular message, a lone back crib. We had the prison system join in. We bought them flat screen TVs and in their central booking area and in their drug court and commercial sex work court and their mental health court, we were able to do education with detainees. And so, and then we took our video that we had that was very powerful, and we developed together with the city with mostly client input. We have it at jury duty. And so what that did was, yes, it's infant safe sleep, but it's no longer like infant mortality, which is very hard for people to get their arms around. It's about a rate. It's just complex. It's abstract. It was like it's sort of like we wanted to make it like a seat belt. There is actually, the lone back crib. We offer portable cribs to every kid in the city. Let's all think about the fact that this is a driving factor, and that actually rallied people around in a way. So yes, we had our strategy, we knew our tiers, we vetted our strategy document, but probably what brought people together the most was this rallying around something that people felt they could actually do something. Like the home visitor actually had a safe sleep observation checklist that we used, and so I just think that was helpful.
No, I appreciate that. Dr. Gabby, you had a question?
Well, thank you. I want to ask you about poverty, Baltimore, New York, which I must say I was unaware of as compared to Columbus. So between 2008 and 2012, for income in the last 12 months below the poverty level, in Columbus the percentage was 14.9%, and in Baltimore was 10.6%. And for children under 5, for Columbus it was 11.6%, and Baltimore 9.8%. And if you look at New York City, and I grew up in and around New York.
Yeah, I heard.
So for Columbus, it was 14.9%, and New York, 13.6%. And for children under 5 in poverty, for Columbus it was 11.6%, and New York 9.5%. We are poorer than both New York and Baltimore. Can we overcome the problem of infant mortality unless we address this issue of poverty? And as you saw your infant mortality improve, and great work that you did you see the rate of poverty improve as well?
Well, I talked earlier about the notion of developing strategies, and one of the strategies that we executed was an economic development strategy for the women that we served on a day-to-day basis. And in 1996, President Clinton developed his welfare reform policy that put a clock on every woman that was on public assistance. And there was a 5-year clock. And that policy kind of like shook us up in New York City, even though he was from our town. Some people believed in that policy, other people did not. But we knew that as a maternal and child health agency, we had to get into the economic development business, right? I happen to have people on my management team, including myself, who had some expertise in doing some of that work. And so we quickly went about the work of developing Harlem Works in 1997. Harlem Works is, I looked at the market in terms of what was on the ground in terms of job readiness programs. I was not impressed. What I wasn't impressed with was that a lot of these programs didn't really survey what the private sector needed in terms of human capital development at entry and intermediate jobs. And so I didn't want to contract with any of these people. I built that capacity inside of my agency, and what we did was over a 9 or 10 year period is place up to 1,500 women at the point of production in our city, working in entry-level and intermediate jobs. Some of those women are members of my board who now have master's degrees. They were former clients of our agency. So we have 2 or 3 women who are my bosses, right, who benefited from Harlem Works and placed them by placing them in jobs, and then they moved on and went back to school and get more degrees, more experience. From an economic development point of view, we work with a community development corporation. We don't have a lot of those core skills inside of our agency. And so just about 3 years ago, we partnered with them to actually build a supermarket, right? We knew that healthy foods was so important to this work. And so we built a brand new supermarket right in our zone. After that, we worked with the Community Development Corporation to develop a 250-unit affordable housing development of 2- and 3-bedroom apartments. Once again, trying to build out, moving out of the health sector into the areas that are driving what? Poverty. I'll stop there.
I mean, I just have a couple of very small comments, much more humble than that, but I mean, that's just that whatever we do, whatever program we do, we want to make sure it's not interrupting what might potentially be the workday for people. So we've really examined closely our home visiting programs. We're really looking at child care and how you can offer that full day. So you think about so when we think about our work or when we introduce a new program, like we brought in Weight Watchers, and part of Weight Watchers is once you've achieved your ideal weight, you actually become employed by them. So we're trying to be very particular about the partners we bring to the table who have an idea that this is not about sort of solving a problem. First of all, it's such a long, as you've said, it's such a long-term issue. So how do we start to think about whatever we're doing, introducing it in a way that's conducive to a stronger workforce? And so we think about workforce development in that kind of, with that kind of philosophy.
That's a great comment. I'll take one more question from the task force, if there is one. Go ahead, Michelle.
I wanted to know, what was the role of your influential business leaders and your corporate citizens in your movements?
I got a great example for you. Just recently, we partnered with the Harlem Children's Zone in the form of Jeffrey Canada and his management team. They really did most of the upfront negotiation work. And we had this vision, and happened to be they wanted to build a new school right in the middle of our zone. We have a 4-block zone that has about 10,000 people that live in it, and we've targeted a lot of our work and put a lot of our resources into that zone. And so Jeffrey had this vision of building a brand new school, and so we went out to 3 corporations. 1, Google's corporation on the West Coast, 2, Goldman Sachs, the banker in the banking community, and we also built a strategic partnership with AT&T. They gave us $100 million, and they gave it to us about 2 or 3 years ago, and last year the school was built, a state-of-the-art school employing almost 238 people in my zone, right, on an ongoing basis. And also there's a guarantee based on the Harlem Children's Zone's framework that everybody that goes to that grade school will be guaranteed money to get to college and pay for their college education. So here are three major corporations using the social impact bond as a leveraging stick in and of itself to finance something that's in our local zone. And hopefully we'll be able to go back to them with other financial projects that will hopefully move the community to another level of community and economic development.
That was phenomenal. Rebecca, did you have anything you want to add?
Only just, again, we sort of think of business leaders and sort of levels. So we have our business leaders in our community, so we really work with barbershops, beauty salons, nail salons in our targeted communities to think about how you mobilize them in a way. How do you map them out? How are they going to be interested parties? How do we incentivize them? So there's business leadership within our communities that we really try to tap into. The small corner stores that are serving such bad food, we spend a lot of time with our food czar in Baltimore trying to think through in our communities where we're working, how do we work with those food shop owners. There's a very large Korean business leadership group that we also spend time with. So there's that sort of community level work. And then we think about how do we find businesses that have aligned incentives, like Weight Watchers is aligned with our goals around obesity reduction, so they give us subsidized rates. CVS Pharmacy just banned tobacco smoke, so we're now partnering with them to think about how do we train all their pharmacists in the communities in which they are in our high-risk areas about if they have a child with asthma that comes in that needs albuterol or something like that, can we train the pharmacist to say, do you have smoking in your household? So thinking about ways that we can leverage the interest of the business along with ours and being sort of very selective about which ones we use.
So we know where they live, and we don't mind flying them here, and we don't mind going there to learn. So I apologize that we are whetting your appetite, but as they both have explained, this is a long-term proposition, and I'm going to wrap this segment up, but guys, you're not off the hook. We do know where you live. But thank you. That's been phenomenal. So, again, take your personal break as needed. There's an aspect of this agenda I'm going to move right into because I think it's so critical to the work that we do, and I think it's a good follow-up to the conversation both Mario and Rebecca had about the data and information and managing toward what you measure. So with that, if you'll recall, in February, Professor Sharon Davies was with us from the Ohio State's Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. She shared with us the hot spots in our community where infant mortality is high and opportunity is low. We took her up on her offer to assist us with our process, and her team has been working diligently to develop some more detailed information about assets and opportunity in our highest risk neighborhoods. Jason Reese is Director of Research at the Kirwan Institute. He's with us to share some findings, along with his colleague David Norris, who is a senior researcher. Please join me in welcoming both Jason and David. They didn't know they were on next. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Can you hear me okay on the mic? Great. First, I want to start off by thanking you for the opportunity to come share some of the work we've been doing here with you today. I also want to thank not only the task force, but all of you in the room for dedicating your time, energy, and attention to this issue, which is not only just a central community challenge that we have in our community here, but as an institute that focuses on issues of racial equity, eliminating racial disparities. It's really one of the premier civil rights issues that we still are dealing with in our country today. So as was referenced in the introduction, we're building upon Sharon Davies' earlier presentation and really providing some more in-depth analysis of these hot spots throughout our community and really trying to understand what is going on in these neighborhoods, what are the characteristics of those neighborhoods, and also where are our programmatic interventions, and eventually where are our assets located. That's the goal of the analysis we've been working on. So we have been doing this analysis now for almost 2 months, since March. David is going to transition in here to the presentation in just a second and provide you an overview of our preliminary results in terms of identifying hotspots in the community. I do want to note there are lots of different methodologies for doing this. We could be looking at just infant deaths, as we're going to focus on here with a longitudinal data set of about 5 years of data. We could be looking at infant mortality rates. We could be looking at critical predictive measures such as low birth weight or preterm births. All of those different methods have their pros and cons. And so again, another goal of this initiative is to take all that data and really triangulate better information in regards to which particular neighborhoods and small scale areas in our community are the predominant contributors to a lot of our infant mortality challenges in this community. So David, do you want to come on up? Sure. Right.
Good morning. So I want to walk you through very quickly a few maps that we've created to sort of set up the layering of data that we're accomplishing through our analysis. I'm going to fly through these. One of the benefits of doing visual presentations is that you can go fairly quickly. I'm going to start by showing you the hotspot map that we've created, starting from the actual death certificate data that we've obtained from the Ohio Department of Health. This says CPH here, that's a typo, but we have also gotten a lot of Columbus Public Health data that we're going to layer on here as well. We took death certificate records from 2007 through 2011. Those were the most recent years that we had available, reliable data. And then we calculated, first of all, we plotted each of the maternal home locations on a map, and then used some statistical analyses to smooth that data into what we call a topography, a map, if you will, of where the hotspots, where the greatest concentrations of infant deaths were. This is all moving toward a common online tool that we want to make available to the community for not only examining where infants are dying, but also the assets and particularly the strategies that could be informed by some of the data that we're going to present here. So in addition to the infant mortality data that you'll see initially, you're also going to see some representations of health outcome data, health service data, some risk factor data, some of the social determinants data. We'll have about 1 or 2 examples of each one of those. Again, and this is preliminary analyses. Some programmatic data, and this one we're going to come back to toward the end of the presentation because this is where we're seeing the greatest data voids. There is a lot of information out there, but the availability of it is kind of tough for us to get hold of. This is an ongoing process. This will not be a static map. It initially will be just kind of a point-in-time picture, but through ongoing data collection efforts, we hope to make this a living online document and resource. And just kind of inherent in everything that I've just said, what we're trying to do with this is to triangulate a wide variety of data from multiple sources so that we can get a really nuanced picture of what's going on in each one of the neighborhoods that we're looking at. So this is the heat map that we've created from the infant mortality data. And you'll see the key on the right there, the coolest areas, the blue areas are the areas with the lowest concentrations of infant deaths. We started with a threshold of 1 infant death per square mile. So those empty areas on the map, it doesn't mean there weren't any infant fatalities there, it's just that they fall below that threshold. And we do this to emphasize where the hotspot areas are. I added that little n equals 770 almost as an afterthought and immediately regretted my after thinking on that because I think it's really important that as we go through this kind of reductionist process of doing the data analysis that we not lose sight of what's underlying this map. Those are 770 lives that were cut short, 770 mothers, fathers, siblings. Just you can think of this more as a heat map of grief, if you will. But you can see, and if you're familiar with the pattern of the city and the county, we did use county-wide data.
but you can see some familiar patterns emerging. And yet, as we start to drill down into some of the data that we layer on top of this heat map, we're starting to see some very interesting patterns emerge that will inform some strategies in some of these different areas. So let me just walk through very quickly some of the examples of the data that we're layering over. Now, in order to layer over a lot of this data, we need to coordinate those areas or correlate those areas with the type of data that we have. And so we have layered on top of these areas census tracts that themselves have a wide variety of data on individuals, on families, on home conditions, et cetera, that we can start to correlate with these hotspot areas. And we've given them the names on the right. Now, these names don't necessarily correlate or correspond exactly to the neighborhood groups in those areas, but we're just using those labels for convenience. Now, those square blocks that you saw that are census tracts, there are about 300 of those across the county. And so the way we're starting to layer this data on visually is to take each one of those census tracts, convert it into a circle, and the size of the circle represents the value of the particular indicator that we're overlaying. And so in this case, this is births to mothers under 18 as a percentage of live births. And you can see that in a lot of cases, the teen pregnancy rates follow the hotspot rates. Now, not exactly in all cases, but in most. Moving on, cases of STDs, in this case chlamydia and gonorrhea combined as a proxy for safe sex practices. Again, you see some correlations, but you're also starting to see some differences among these different communities. And as we layer on layer after layer of data, more and more of these differences emerge that help us to characterize the individual neighborhood areas. A couple more examples. Births paid by Medicaid. Again, you can see a broader distribution of births. They aren't just concentrated to the hot spots, but this does contribute some information to our understanding of these particular neighborhood areas. And finally then, a final example, percent of households receiving SNAP, a social determinant indicator that we use as a proxy for poverty, although not necessarily, because other folks receive SNAP benefits in the short term when they're in crisis as well. So with that, I want to turn it back over to Jason, and he's going to drill down into some of the data a little more in depth.
Thank you, David. And for those of you following along with the handouts that were prepared earlier, you'll notice some slides that are in the handouts are not in our presentation today. We moved those to the end just for the sake of time management. So we'll just be hitting the highlights of many of those findings that you'll see in that handout. So I want to go back to what David mentioned in terms of thinking about the geography of our community. We have almost 300 census tracts, the census definition for neighborhood in our county. We've identified 27 of those that we've flagged as our infant mortality hotspots. Those 27 census tracts hold about 9% of our county's population. With the data we looked at, they held about 12% of all live births. But here's where I want to really focus. Those 27 census tracts held almost a quarter of all the infant deaths during this time period. So a disparity ratio of about 2 to 1 if you compared births to the number of deaths proportionally found there. In terms of the dimensions of racial equity that we are concerned about with this problem and the severe racial disparities that we see that these hotspots are major contributors to the racial disparities we see in outcomes. So almost 1 in 3 non-white infant deaths were in those 27 neighborhoods that we identified, those 27 census tracts. So what do those census tracts, what do those communities, those hotspot areas look like demographically or looking at different social determinants? 6 of the 8 areas are predominantly non-white, with the exception being Franklinton, and it's really West Franklinton that's the actual hotspot, not East Franklinton, in the Hilltop area. We also see fairly significant immigrant communities in 3 of the hotspots, with the highest concentration in a zone we refer to as the Northeast. So this is very important because when we look at a lot of the infant health data, we have difficulty diving deeper into issues of race and ethnicity. So this neighborhood data helps us get a better understanding of questions like, where are our Latino mothers or Latino families who have had to deal with infant mortality issues. Where are Somali families or other immigrant communities that aren't necessarily well captured in the data that we have? This neighborhood information will help with that considerably. Again, we're going to reflect a lot of the findings that were presented at the beginning of our session today. So I'll go back to that notion of triangulation. You're going to hear a lot of triangulation in our presentation with the remarks and the recommendations and the findings by our earlier presenters. These are primarily communities that are heavily impoverished, much higher poverty rates than what we find countywide for a typical neighborhood in the county. And most severe poverty problems we see in West Franklinton, also the Near East Side, but across the board we see poverty rates of around 30% to up to 50% in these areas. And that's also reflected in the number of families who are receiving SNAP in those areas as well. We see a lot of households that are dealing with housing issues, particularly rental households. The chart here on the left-hand side of the screen illustrates the proportion, and look at that tall bar, that's the proportion of renters who are cost burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And you can see the kind of extreme numbers there in terms of some of these neighborhoods where we've got basically about 3 out of 4 of the renters in those neighborhoods cost burden in regards to their housing situation. We heard about transportation issues earlier today, and the data really supports that. So across the board, there's a number of our neighborhoods where we'll see about 15 to 20% of the residents in those neighborhoods without a private automobile. In Franklinton and on the Near East Side, we see much higher numbers of isolation in terms of transportation isolation or dependence on public transit. So a definite problem that we see across the different communities. Thinking about other neighborhood stressors that we know are important, blight, vacancy, fairly significant vacancy rates for residential properties across the board. Also, when we look at crime rates, David analyzed about 10 years of violent crime data from Columbus Police Department and found very, very severe disparities in violent crime rates in these different neighborhoods. So if you were to think about kind of the model of what does a distressed hotspot neighborhood look like, many of these neighborhoods fit that model very well. As David mentioned, and I'll move through these pretty quickly because we don't have a lot of information at this time to share. An early goal of this project was really to get a feel of this landscape of interventions that we have in our community. And again, reflecting an earlier comment about us being program poor and program rich and systems poor. We are in some ways data rich, but systemically we're data poor. Very challenging to gather data, so I'll just give you a small sample of this today. And also reflect upon kind of this use of zip code data. Unfortunately, for some of the programs that we looked at, zip codes were the smallest level of geography that we could look at. We would use zip codes if there were no other alternatives. But in general, they're nowhere near as useful as getting the more precise address level information that we really need to have the precision we need to in understanding this problem. So the online system that we'll be setting up, we'll be looking at things like the healthcare infrastructure, particularly the infrastructure that exists across the county for maternal and infant health. So programmatic interventions. What you're seeing here, and just walk you through the symbology here, the yellow areas on the map here represent our hotspots. The green-blue background here represents zip codes for some of the various home visiting programs and zip codes in terms of the distribution of where those home visits were made. So we certainly see some clustering here with the Ohio Infant Mortality Reduction Initiative. But for example, if we look at pregnancy support services, we see that programmatic intervention spread a little more like peanut butter. So for a problem that you almost need a scalpel to actually have pinpoint precision in looking at these neighborhoods, we're using a butter knife to spread our resources across. And so what we hope to do with this is really to look at all of these different interventions we're doing and trying to get a feel for, if we look at the geography of the county, where are we investing our resources right now, and how does that investment look compared to the scale of the problem in different communities? And again, looking at other data sets in terms of health professional shortage areas, medically underserved populations. So a few early findings that we'll share with you today, and we have 4 primary findings from this first kind of 2 months of work. First being that we certainly have hot spots that kind of fit the textbook definition of what a distressed infant mortality hotspot would look like, but it's important to note that these communities are not monolithic. We have neighborhoods that are primarily urban, distressed communities that are mostly low-income communities of color. We also have some neighborhoods that are urban, distressed communities that are predominantly low-income white communities. So it's important to note if we're thinking about interventions around cultural competency and care, where we target those resources, how we look at issues such as race and disparities in diagnosis. So important information as we try to get a feel for the differences in these different neighborhoods. Also important to note where we found hot spots in some ways that we weren't expecting were neighborhoods that weren't quite as distressed as some of our urban areas that I just referred to, but also had unique populations, primarily immigrant populations. When we found much higher rates, or excuse me, much higher incidence of infant mortality in those areas than we expected. And of course, just key to note the other distinctions between neighborhoods. So for example, transportation is going to be a bigger issue on the Near East Side and in Franklinton than it may be in the community up in the Northeast. Vacancy and crime are going to vary across these different neighborhoods. And so we, again, as we think about these holistic interventions that are needed, we need to have the data to help inform the structure of those interventions and where we invest. Second point to make today is in really reflecting some of the great experiences shared today, both from Baltimore and New York City. You've heard place-based all morning. And our suggestion is from the data that we've looked at here in Columbus and actually have been looking at for a very long time with our partners at the Ohio Department of Health, Columbus is ripe for place-based interventions. Columbus also has some very good and potentially model place-based programs, such as Moms to Be that was mentioned earlier, that we have to think about how we're leveraging successful interventions like that. Also, if we're going to focus on place-based interventions, we have to think about that as an opportunity to get deeper into some of the race-based disparities in our community. And I want to note, 1 in 3 of our non-white infant deaths are in those 27 census tracts. 1 in 3. Finally, there's supposed to be a picture there that didn't show up. I want to note from a community development perspective and from an asset-based development perspective, we're actually very fortunate. And I want to shift away kind of thinking about the deficits in these neighborhoods. Many of these neighborhoods have very significant assets, institutions. As a Southside resident, I can name you off about a dozen assets in our community that are critical. And I would also say that many of these neighborhoods have, to some degree, either fledgling or very advanced community development efforts that are underway. And we're starting to see a real shift in that trajectory of disinvestment and population loss that these neighborhoods have dealt with for decades, and these neighborhoods are starting to shift towards more positive outcomes. That is a really great thing. The challenge is, and to go back to this question of collective impact, how well are our public health stakeholders interacting with these community development stakeholders in our neighborhoods? Are we leveraging off of each other enough? Do we even understand the different assets that are in these different neighborhoods that we can build upon? These are questions we really need to answer. Are there particular assets that could be at risk in neighborhoods that we have to focus on? Finally, our final finding and recommendation. You've heard discussion about data all day today. And I've been with Kerwin for 11 years. I've done projects like this in about 30-some states across the country. This is not a unique Franklin County or Columbus problem. We definitely have a data issue here when it comes to this challenge. We have lots of information out there. We need a real systemic way to look at it, to document it, to regularly track our outcomes. As David mentioned earlier, we need to triangulate There are unique distinctions to a lot of these different data sources, and I've seen some of the handouts that were passed out today noting just the differences, just looking at infant health outcomes and the different data sources that are out there. We need to have all this information and really utilize it and leverage it to the best of our abilities. I'm sharing a draft map. This is something in progress that we're doing for the Ohio State Wexner Medical Center right now, where we're mapping out a OSU or Wexner Medical Center and OSU-wide survey of different community engagement interventions that the university's health sciences departments are involved with. It would be fantastic for me to be able to present a map to you of all the different interventions that are going on here in Franklin County for infant and maternal health, for the different hospital systems, for the public sector, for the nonprofit sector. What we need is a comprehensive way of surveying these activities that are going on, documenting these activities, and regularly keeping that updated. That's going to be the best way to know if we're deploying our resources in an efficient and effective way. One last note in terms of our next steps with this work, we'll be continuing to analyze this data. We are going to do some initial asset mapping activities in those hotspot areas, identifying those critical assets in those neighborhoods. And as David mentioned earlier, the goal of this is to create an interactive website that folks from across the tools that we'll be producing in the upcoming month. Thank you.
We've heard from a number of experts today how important it is to establish an accountability structure to ensure successful implementation of what we've been talking about here. Recognizing this, Donna and I, along with Council President Ginther, have put together some initial ideas on accountability. And in front of you is an organizational chart I'd ask you to take a look at. Where we've arrived at thus far is the need for an annual scorecard so that we can demonstrate our progress in order to continue to drive results. It will also ensure some transparency, and those results will be released publicly and reported out every year. Whether it's virtual or real, the work needs to be overseen. We kind of feel strongly it needs to be overseen by an independent entity that can help drive change. We think it's important that the investment that we made, based on the investment that we made, that we establish an executive committee, if you will, or a subset of the members of this task force to work potentially with some others as well as some community leaders to oversee implementation of this. We believe that we've dedicated the resources, the time thus far. We need to support a project lead, somebody in essence who, as we've talked about, is going to wake up every day in this community thinking about this problem. And as much as we're not looking to build another bureaucracy, we think this individual position is important, probably for something like a 3 to 5 year period to build on the work that this committee has done. Central to the success of this will be a performance management system, communication and community engagement, and this is something that we think the subset of this committee should undertake here in the next few months. In front of you is not only this chart, which you need to take a look at, but also some questions that we'd like the task force to answer before you leave today. It shouldn't take you too long. If you would, just jot down some answers on that. At this point, the accountability, we've kept talking about this for the last few weeks, how important accountability is, and we've heard that today from our experts. So that's our next step. So fill these out if you would, and with that, I'll turn it back to Donna.
So I know we're in a rush to close, and I apologize for that, but what I won't apologize for is the information that has been shared with us today about models. and models from different communities, whether it's New York, Baltimore, the Magnolia Initiative. We have a lot to think about, and we've got a lot of planning to do. So I don't want us to be encumbered by the fact that, June is our last meeting, because that's the beginning of next, not the end of this, is the only way I can come up with to describe it. And don't make me repeat that, because I'm not sure it made any sense.
Made perfect sense.
But we do need your feedback on the accountability model. What's missing? What you think we need to add or rethink? What does, administrative host mean? What are you guys talking about there? I'm going to ask you, because we've got maybe 15 minutes left, to just with the person beside you or at your table, have a 5-minute conversation about this accountability model and give us one or two, kind of food for thought or things that hit you to say, I really think we need to make sure it has X. Something I wrote down is data collection and mapping. Maybe it's in here, but, it was important enough to me to make sure we really got to get. When I heard this guy say we're kind of data poor, and then I heard our experts talk about how important the data is to accountability and map and tracking that, we got to work on that. Glad to hear them talk about a website. I mean, that's phenomenal. So take 5 minutes, look at the model, look at the questions, but most importantly, based upon what you heard, what do you think is missing, and what do you think we need to put double asterisks beside because it's really important? Just in your groups there. Thank you. Hopefully you have someone who's a scribe and wrote down some notes, and if you didn't, someone do that, because Jesse and Julie would like that information, just your notes on this accountability model. So I'm going to start with the table in the back, because I caught Councilwoman Michelle Mills's eye, and she's going to not quite kill me. But give me one or two things that you guys thought, we need to be very thoughtful about, or put a double asterisk beside in terms of what we have in this straw person model. You notice I didn't say straw man? That was funny. All right, go ahead, Michelle.
I believe Dr. Long is the phenomenal leader at the table that will share
I love
comments
a woman who
from
can
our
delegate.
group.
That was a delegation. Well, we did talk about, I think, and it's already been raised, about the importance of the high-level leadership, both the city of Columbus and Franklin County, being connected in that way. And then we've had two different themes. One about the connection to the conversations that are very active in this community around education and poverty and housing, and that this has to be connected in some way, because it's not independent of that. And yet these are ways to monitor and account for work that probably in all those areas will impact infant mortality. And then we were talking about the choice of a neighborhood or hoods, and both the power of having lots of projects already going on, but also some of the high need and vulnerable neighborhoods don't have either anchor projects, anchor institutions, and how do we think about that when we get to that point? And that's really our conversation.
Excellent. Michelle, I'm going to come around to you guys next, if that's okay.
Well, we appointed Michelle because she runs an organization that I think has some analogous
Absolutely.
operational constraints.
All right.
Michelle?
First thing I did was I put a big circle next to the city that said county, because I think there's got to be involvement with others. Also, we did talk about getting especially some of our local state representatives and leaders involved with us to be champions for us at the state level. We do know the administration at the state supports us, but also getting some of that going. I wanted to point out that we need to develop a tolerance for failure with rapid cycle prototyping that I don't think may exist right now. Even as we've done our change in the homeless system, quite a bit of the feedback that I've gotten, frankly, from some of the leaders in the community is, you better have gotten this right. This better be right. And much of it is right, and much of it is not right, and to correct tolerance for quick learning and failure, quick learning and understanding that part of the learning is because we failed. The gentleman from Los Angeles, I think, really spoke to that very, very well. I think it's important. We also, whether we want to think about it or not, there will be much kumbaya around this until the rubber hits the road and things really begin to change.
Low kumbaya and high rubber meets the road.
We need the rubber to hit the road, and what happens is it's all fun and games as long as it's an existential conversation. And when it becomes real is when people get uncomfortable. We have to prepare for that. We have to get people involved. But we also have to have a way to bring our outliers in, and there has to be an accountability and an integration to make sure that those outliers come in. And if they don't want to come in, then we have to move on. We can't get stuck.
Love it. You guys are great. Okay, who at my next table? Yvonne? Ms. Honeycutt, you have been elected.
Well, I had an opportunity to work with Dr. Gabby, and right away we were quickly aligned with what we saw as some of our more attractive areas in approaching this work. One was we really firmly believe that we have to have more of an alignment and integrated services coordination in our systems. We recognize that in social services that there is a national model in the country that is beginning to look at ways to take many of our providers, many of the professionals in the community, and integrate some of those services together. We think that it's just absolutely absurd that many of our families are very confused about where they're going, seeking services. They get to one particular facility, and then they're being told to go somewhere else. And so it's almost a low-hanging fruit. There's an opportunity, a grave opportunity that exists for that. The second piece was data collection. And so not only just data collection, but as Michelle mentioned before about the rubber meeting the road, is what are we doing once we get this information? And so Dr. Gabby shared with us some very startling statistics around the poverty levels here in Columbus versus Baltimore and New York. And I don't think this is like a spoiler alert for many people in the room, but what are we doing with this information now? Mm-hmm. So we know what our poverty levels look like. How are we going to change the trajectory of many of our families and children? And then lastly, the Kirwan Institute has been a leading research organization in this community and showing us that place and race does matter. It absolutely behooves us to think about how are we providing cultural competent services, quality leaders, instructors, curriculums, all those different tools to be able to address some of the issues around the lack of access for services in communities of color and being able to meet people where they are. And so those were the three areas that we were most attracted to. And the only other thing I want to just as a footnote is this is a very timely discussion for us as our state leaders are working on infant mortality. There is a bill right now being sponsored in the Senate Bill 279 by Senator Tavares and Jones. And I think that Columbus or Franklin County can be that model community because we've already had the progress under the leadership of President Ginther to begin to look at ways that we are comprehensively approaching this issue.
And I'm going to give the final word. It's either going to be Kathy Little, Dr. Good, who's going to, I'm sorry? Oh, we've got and we're going to come back to the dynamic duo here with the county commissioner and Nathan. Thank you.
I had a great conversation with David Blum, Ohio Health, who would encourage an executive committee with horsepower to be able to align the resources, but also make tough decisions when the effectiveness of those.
Tough choices.
And choices. He reminded me that he's got a van that goes into the neighborhoods, but sometimes it doesn't go anywhere because the resources aren't asked for or, again, not aligned with the need. He said, I'd be willing to step back and say, is that effectiveness? If we can throw that into the mix and make it better, we should do that. The only other thing that we talked about was making sure that we talked about a lot of things, but to do it with the community, not to the community.
And I had the pleasure of working with Karen Hughes
using the First Lady, and we started at a very esoteric level, really, and talked about what are some of the barriers, some of the challenges to our communities being unable to have a coherent strategy, whether it's related to infant mortality, to education, which seems to be on the flavor of the month, nutrition. We don't seem to be able to get there, and what are some of those barriers, and why aren't we able to celebrate where this is organically occurring? And so we looked at the bottom of the chart here, of the schematic, and we talked about, we gave an example where Anthony Troutman and I met about 3 weeks ago and said, think of how the whole would be greater than the sum of the parts if we would couple our morning summer school programs with your afternoon summer camp opportunities, and the exponential gains for families, both educationally and in nutrition, but also then in childcare as well, and the other kinds of wellness activities that occur. And so this is something organic, and how do we build on those successes? That's where the rubber hits the road for us, but also address some of those real challenges that seem to have prevented our community from getting there, probably with the exception of the Community Shelter Board. We could learn so much from you, Michelle.
That's a classic description of how this can't be just an accountability model, to paraphrase a little birdie that just whispered in my ear, but it's got to allow for creativity, organic evolution of new ideas and the right ideas. So the county and Nathan Hurd.
Nathan and I talked about the table of organization, the structure. One of the things that we kind of focused on was the idea that there needs to be some stability, some long-term stability. That, as Mario said, 18 years they've been working on this problem in Manhattan, and you talked about the need for the lead, but not only the lead, but the executive committee to have some stability behind it, to be able to operate over the course of a period of time. We're looking at least 3 to 5 years, maybe longer, that we're going to need to focus on this issue. People come and go. Elected leaders come and go. The heads of organizations come and go. The good thing about what Andy's put together here with the structure of this task force is the stakeholders that are in this room and that have continued to be in this room throughout this process are the organizations and the folks that will, even if people come and go, the organizations will have a need and will be here through time. And so those were some of the things that Nathan and I focused on. We're having a conversation internally at the county. Anthony and I have talked. We need to figure out internally where we're going to be and how we're going to push this effort forward. So, sorry, Nathan, I may have taken the entire conversation away from you. I apologize.
That's why I like working with you guys. Spot on point. We are at the noon hour. So by June 9th, just give you quick next steps. You'll receive an electronic copy of a draft report. It is in the making. The team has been working, trying to pull together information and your feedback all along the way. It is a draft. People will come to you, meet with you individually before it becomes final. We hope to adopt a final report/approach with recommendations to remain fluid as we try to learn as we go at our June 25th meeting. And if you cannot be at that meeting, once you get this draft report, please provide us with any feedback or any issues that would make you comfortable with supporting it, because we would like to have your support as we go forward. We need that support as we go forward. You can expect the recommendations to tie back into the key drivers, the data and information that we've received, and to be multi-year. Because it is critical that we not look at this as something we can get done in 6 months, because we won't. Any questions about process or next steps at this point? All right. I want to thank all of our experts that traveled here to be with us. yesterday, today, and who will continue to work with us. And I want to thank all of you and everyone in the public who sat through this this time and this information. Your commitment and engagement is much appreciated, and there is more to come. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.